which is being reported is these gangs are using the same tactics that they use in big cities, in deprived areas, to co-opt the participation of young people. They're using with indigenous communities, basically offering drugs to them, offering them the opportunity of being rich or having wealth in exchange for taking part in drug trafficking. And that is having a huge impact on the indigenous communities in the same ways that it happens in big cities across the world.
Leonardo Rocha. There was a time when Argentina was one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America, but according to recent data from the United Nations, nearly a third of the population suffers from food insecurity. As a result, more and more people have been driven from their homes and into slums. Our reporter Agustina Latorret travelled to Silencia, a slum in Argentina's poorest city, to see the consequences.
Most houses here are made out of wood. They look precarious. Entire families of 6 or 7 live cramped in one room. Silencio is right next to the biggest landfill in the city. It's an ocean of garbage, glass, plastic, food waste. But this is not how the people here see it. They see an opportunity. Like Julio. He comes here every day at dawn and looks for materials that he can resell to a recycling center. He's 19 years old. He looks exhausted from working all day in the heat.
Mi trabajo cuando por ahí es duro, por ahí cuando está fuerte el sol.
The work is tough. The sun is really strong and makes my head hurt.
It can be dangerous. This is Pedro Sena from Caritas.
En los basurales, más allá de que corres peligro de cortarte, de...
On top of the risk of cutting yourself, you could eat rotten food. There's a lot of bacteria. We've had cholera. We've had a lot of diseases. But people keep living off rubbish, not only because they need money, but because that's the only reality they know.
But for Julio, it's all worth the risk. He shows us his home, which is made out of wood and sticks, nylon and plastic. It only has one room that he shares with his wife and daughter. This is Rocío. She's 19. She lives in a slum near Julio.
The signal is really bad here. As much as I can ask a classmate to borrow their phone, I can't really study here because I don't have any internet. So I decided to leave school because I had no one to explain things to me at home. I feel that the government is turning its back on us.
Rocío started working at the landfill when she was just 8 years old. She would go in the afternoon after school, but now that she can't access any education, this has become her whole life. Sometimes she has no option but to eat what she finds.
If the food is in good condition and ready to eat, we eat it.
But what Julio and Rocío are going through doesn't just happen in slums. Inflation is at more than 60% in Argentina, only second to Venezuela in the region. Food is ever more expensive. Now, more than 1/3 of the population doesn't have access to enough nutritious food. Which means that for many teenagers, surviving of this landfill and building their whole lives around it is their only option.
Agustina Latorret with that report from Concordia in Argentina. 10 miners remain trapped in a coal mine that collapsed and flooded on Wednesday in Mexico. Hundreds of rescuers are now involved in the efforts, including several divers. The mine is in the town of Sabinas in northern Mexico and in a region that is no stranger to incidents of this kind. The BBC's Azadeh Moshiri has this report.
Mexico's president says rescue efforts to save 10 workers trapped in a coal mine have reached a crucial point. The miners have been deep underground since Wednesday, after their excavation caused a tunnel wall to cave in and triggered floods in 3 wells. 5 of the workers managed to escape within the first 24 hours, but since then, no survivors have been found. Rescuers are working on pumping out the water that's filled the mine to allow divers to enter.
The good news is that the pump, which has much more capacity, is emptying one of the wells. This will hopefully deliver a very positive result compared to what was achieved throughout the night.
So the families have been waiting and hoping for good news, sleeping through the night in cots, blankets, plastic chairs and whatever else they could find.
We are still hoping that they are in a higher part, although it is too much water. The well was up to the top, but we trust in God.
The incident has brought back memories of the Pasta de Conchos tragedy in 2006, when an explosion killed 65 people in a local mine. Mexico's president has said investigations into who is responsible this time will have to wait. The focus right now is on saving lives.
Today, Mashiri. And Neil has some other stories from our news desk.
A senior official in southern Ukraine, installed by the Russians, has been assassinated. Vitaly Gura, who was second in command in the occupied Kakhovka district, died of his wounds in hospital. According to his colleagues, Mr. Gura was shot several times while at home. The U.S. President Joe Biden has tested negative for COVID-19 days after getting a second bout of the virus. Mr. Biden, who is 76, first tested positive for the virus more than 2 weeks ago. He had been in isolation for a second time after getting what his doctor described as a rebound case. 12 people have been killed after a bus carrying Polish pilgrims veered off a road in Croatia on Saturday and ended up in a ditch. All 32 surviving passengers are said to be injured, 19 of them seriously. 3 priests and 6 nuns were on the coach, which was on the way to Medjugorje, a Catholic shrine in Bosnia. And the Ugandan government has suspended the country's leading gay rights organization, accusing it of operating illegally. Officials say the group did not register with the authorities.
Still, Canada's national sport, ice hockey, is facing a serious reckoning over a sexual misconduct scandal. Multiple players have been accused of sexual assault and major sponsors are turning their backs on the game. As Charlotte Gallagher now reports.
Well, Canada, here we go again. Another night of watching the best hockey players in the world.
Ice hockey is huge, millions of dollars, but its family-friendly reputation has taken a battering recently. It began last April when a woman alleged that in 2018 she was sexually assaulted by 8 players, including members of the World Junior team. It emerged in May this year that she had agreed a financial settlement with the sports governing body, Hockey Canada. It wasn't just the alleged assault which concerned people, it was how Hockey Canada handled the case and where it got the settlement money. The cash came from membership fees paid by young players across the country. This horrified many parents who'd been paying into the fund. The organisation has admitted it paid out 8.9 million Canadian dollars in 21 settlements since 1989 and has been dealing with 1 to 2 allegations of sexual assault every year. The Canadian Parliament has frozen Hockey Canada's federal funding, with the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, calling for the organisation to face a real reckoning. Unsurprisingly, the news has seen sponsors flee, and the chairman of the board of directors has also stood down. With the spotlight now on the sport, it's anticipated more allegations will emerge. Ice hockey isn't the first sport to face this type of reckoning. Child abuse scandals at US gymnastics and UK football clubs have led to jail sentences.
Charlotte Gallagher. Now let's cross to Paul Sayers with the sport. Paul, English Premier League returned this weekend earlier than ever.
Yes, it did. It did indeed, Joe. Yes, Liverpool supporters would have been confident, I think, ahead of their opening match of the campaign away at newly promoted Fulham. However, they struggled to a 2-2 draw, twice coming from behind to get a point against Marco Silva's side, much to the annoyance of their manager, Jurgen Klopp.
Fine with the point. We don't think we deserve more today. And yeah, we can win the game lucky as well. It doesn't happen to us that often. But starting the game was really bad from us. It's like no direction, no positivity, no opening up, no breaking lines, nothing what you have to do.
There was a big win for another of the promoted sides, Joe. Bournemouth, they beat Aston Villa 2-0. Elsewhere, Chelsea were 1-0 winners at Everton. Leeds beat Wolves 2-1. Spurs came from a goal down to beat Southampton 4-1. And Newcastle were 2-0 winners over Nottingham Forest. 3 more matches in the Premier League on Sunday, including the champions Manchester City. They take on West Ham at the London Stadium.
And changing to athletics, a couple of big medals for African athletes in the Commonwealth Games.
That's right, yes. Let's have a listen to this, Joe.
She's the strongest I've ever seen in the home straight, Mary Mora, and she's going to come away to take the gold medal. Mary Mora with an incredible performance. Keely Hodgkinson has to settle for silver again.
That was the inimitable Steve Cram talking us through Kenya's Mary Mora taking the gold in the women's 800 metres ahead of Keely Hodgkinson of England and Laura Muir of Scotland. And Uganda's Joshua Kiplimo as well. He did the distance double, adding 5,000 metre gold to the 10,000 he won earlier in the week. And Elaine Thompson-Hera of Jamaica won the 200 metres to do the sprint double too.
Now, to my favourite sport, rugby, what's going on with the All Blacks? Once the best team in the world, but they're struggling.
They really are struggling, Joe. Yes, they've lost 5 of their last 6 test matches, including their opener in the Rugby Championship against South Africa on Saturday. South Africa beat them by the biggest scoreline in almost 100 years in the game between the two. They were beaten by France last year on their Northern Hemisphere tour. They lost to Ireland in Dublin too. Then the Irish, Joe, as I'm sure you must be aware, beat them twice in New Zealand to win their first ever test series against the All Blacks on their own territory. And now this defeat at South Africa. They face the Springboks again next weekend, Joe, followed by 2 home matches against Argentina and then Australia home and away in the Rugby Championship, all before the end of September.
Thanks, Paul. I'm sure they'll get it back together for the World Cup next year. Thanks for that, Paul Serres there. And there's concern in France over a beluga whale which has strayed from its usual cold water habitat and ended up in the River Seine. The whale is swimming slowly in a basin between 2 lochs about 80 kilometres north of Paris and appears emaciated. Wildlife experts have been trying to feed it with dead herring and fresh trout, but the
4-metre-long animal is refusing food. Isabelle Doriat-Puzet is a local official.
Collectively, scientists, wildlife protection associations and public services have all been mobilized. Our goal is the interest of the animal, and he will dictate to us his wishes. Among the options is reopening the loch towards the sea, which is more than 160 kilometers away, so that he can resume his journey. Other options are to care for it or to keep it for a while so that it can regain its appetite, but it's too early to say.
Vets will now try to inject it with vitamins or possibly even remove it from the water, but a decision will have to be taken soon as whales cannot survive long-term in fresh water. It's the 3rd time this year whales have been spotted in the Seine, prompting speculation that it may be the result of climate change. And that story brings us to the end of the Newsroom programme here on the BBC World Service with me, Joe Lynham. Stay tuned for the headlines.
This is the BBC World Service, and for the next World Book Club, Harriet Gilbert is talking to Ya Jassi about her novel Homegoing.
I do think that this project was partly an attempt to think through my own family history, albeit a fictionalized one.
Opening in the 18th century in West Africa, Homegoing begins with 2 half-sisters who don't know each other. One is sold into slavery. The other becomes a slave trader's wife.
It was an incredibly difficult book to write.
Descendants from Africa to America, with each generation bearing the
time itself to feel as though it were a character.
World Book Club with Ya Jassi in half an hour.
Hello, I wonder whether you'd describe your boss as kind and compassionate, or maybe you are the boss. What would people say about you? By now, we know how important a happy workplace is for our mental health, but in the cutthroat world of work, is it really possible for managers to be kind all the time and successful? I'm Claudia Hammond, and after the News and Health Check, I'll be turning to psychological research from around the world to find out the answer. Do join me if you can.
BBC News with Neil Nunes. Officials from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey and the United Nations have authorized 5 more grain ships to leave Ukrainian ports. The Joint Coordination Center, which is managing the Black Sea Grain Initiative, said it would monitor the safe passage of the vessels through the maritime humanitarian corridor. The head of the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, says he's increasingly alarmed about the risk of disaster at the Zaporizhzhia power plant in Ukraine. Rafael Grossi said military action there could threaten public health and the environment in Ukraine and beyond. Israel says it has killed a second senior leader of the Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. Military officials say Khalid Mansour was killed in an Israeli airstrike on the city of Rafah. Cuba has asked the United States and other countries for help to put out a fire in fuel storage tanks in the coastal city of Matanzas. The blaze began when one of the 8 depots was hit by lightning on Friday night. 17 firefighters had been reported missing and more than 120 people were injured. Brazilian police have arrested 5 people for fishing illegally in an indigenous reservation where a high-profile indigenous expert and a British journalist were killed 2 months ago. Bruno Pereira and the journalist Tom Phillips were ambushed and shot dead as they investigated the involvement of organized crime with commercial fishing in Brazil's Amazon region. Joe Biden's doctor says the president has tested negative for COVID-19 days after getting a second bout of the virus. The 79-year-old first tested positive for coronavirus more than 2 weeks ago. Dr. Kevin O'Connor said the U.S. leader would continue to isolate until he has a second negative test. That's the latest BBC News.
Up to you. Yeah, it's Mike Brown.
Hi.
Claudia?
Yes, this is Claudia.
Give me 1 second.
This is Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond, and once again, today's episode is informed by the results of the kindness test, the online study which a whopping 60,000 of you took part in.
Let me see, it might be my fifth step. A little fun.
I thought it was time we looked at the place where we spend a lot of our time, work.
Does this help or no?
Oh, that helps.
A little bit better?
Yeah. And so today, I want to know, can bosses be kind?
Wow, you hit me with the question I thought you would ask last, but that's okay, right?
We can always do it again last too, but yes.
The answer is yes. They can be kind, as much as it's hard for us to believe, but I also think we suffer from this negativity bias, and it's everywhere, where we remember those people who've done the wrong thing but succeeded. We remember those
so we just remember the bad ones.
Yes, and if you've ever talked to people and asked people, a really interesting experiment, ask someone, to describe their experience with a good boss, and it will be a nice conversation. And ask them to tell you something about a bad boss, an uncaring boss, an unfair boss, and you will not be able to stop them talking.
Well, talking is a radio presenter's job, so who better to ask than some of my friends presenting science programmes? Robin Ince in a moment. First up, Hannah Fry and Adam Rubb.
He just straight up prefer chuckling along in the background here.
They do exist.
Yeah. There was one occasion to interview somebody for a job. I was perfectly qualified to do this. As we were sort of setting up for the panel, the other big shot professor had left the room. I was still quite junior at this point in time. And while I was in there with this boss on our own, he turned to me and he said, regulations now say that you have to have 1 woman on the panel, and the more senior woman in our department was busy today, and that's why you're here.
That's amazing.
Where is he now, eh? So, that's all I say about that.
Sorry, I just grabbed it and we eat wine gums.
Off the top of my head, it's much easier to come up with the bad bosses.
I have found BBC Inside Science's Marnie Chesterton. Go on. Who's bad?
It was this woman who'd started a boutique chocolate shop, and she was just rude to all of the customers. There was a lot of hate spewing out of a woman, so you'd think that chocolate shop would be like ideal job.
It should be lovely, and you get to eat chocolate.
It was a job I lasted 1 day.
Today I'm come to a restaurant in East London in England to find out, because we have all known some bosses who aren't that kind. Now, is that because running any business or department or school or restaurant is so hard that it's just not possible to keep on top of things and be kind all the time? I am here to meet a boss who deliberately set out to create a kind and happy culture in a sector that is not always known for its kindness. He's the co-founder of Pizza Pilgrims, Tom Elliott. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. It smells very lovely in here. Now, first of all, does hospitality deserve its bad rep. I mean, I did my share of waitressing. It wasn't always easy, shall I put it that way?
I think probably historically it does, unfortunately. I think, that era, the big alpha male, pan throwing, big shouting.
Absolutely. We had a chef. If anyone sent anything back, he would headbutt the fridge.
Yeah. So that guy or girl has got a lot to answer for, and I think the industry is so different now.
I notice you don't use the word boss.
I really can't stand the word boss. I think there's just this horrible sort of implied authority that's not earned. It's just this feeling of like, I say it and you do it, and there's no questioning of it. And actually, the people on the floor serving the customers, they're the people that know more about this business than anyone. There are rules to follow, but with scope to make it your own. And I think the danger is to look at kindness as a one-to-one experience, and it's actually a one-to-team or team-to-team. It's kind of a much more web-like experience, I think.
Does it work? What's your staff turnover like? Do people stay a long time?
Some people stay for a long time. Antimo, who's the manager of this particular store, he has worked with us for coming up to 10 years. The test that we really look for is people coming back. That's the magic moment of like, I went away, I did my gap year, I went travelling, or whatever it was, and then I landed. Ever we recruit anyone senior, you can sit them in a room and talk to them and ask them big questions that they can answer well. But actually, I always conduct important interviews in the company in a restaurant environment to see like, how does that person engage with the waiter? Because if they're dismissive or too important for that person, then they're not for us.
So they're not kind to the waiter, they don't get the job?
100% not. That should be true, but that should be like a law.
Hi guys, you ready to order? Can I get you some drinks?
Can I just have water, please? Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that, Tom, and I am very much looking forward to trying out the pizzas. I've been wondering what the research can tell us about whether kindness in business really does result in success. It seems to here, but does it always? Now, I've been researching a book chapter on kindness in leadership, but you do kind of need to sort the wheat from the chaff. So I know just the person to go to.
My name is Joe Folkman. I'm a psychometrician, a psychologist that focuses on measurement. We have a leadership development practice. There's a famous quote, more is written and less is known about leadership than any other topic. And
so true.
It is true. And anybody can write a leadership book, and they write it from their experience. And you listen to the experience and go, wow, that's really valuable. But there's not a shred of evidence. There's not a shred of research there. What we've tried to do is be an evidence-based leadership development firm, making conclusions from the data.
And so one of the things you've collected data on is how nice bosses are, really, how likeable they are and how effective they are. You did some work in 2013, and I like the title, I'm a Boss, Why Should I Care If You Like Me? What did you find?
We wanted to look at likability, and we had a data set of about 51,000 leaders, divided them into 4 groups, the worst leaders to the best leaders. And then we divided them into 4 groups based on likability, the most likable to the least likable. What we wondered is what's the chances of you being a great leader in the top quartile, the top 4th, if you were unlikable in the bottom quartile? And guess what? Out of 51,000...
that is then playing some kind of part in why you're a great leader.
You can see it in our graphs that the more likable you are, the higher your rating is in terms of overall leadership effectiveness. It's a key component. We find an absolute clear correlation between this leadership effectiveness as we're measuring leaders on 60 behaviors and outcomes such as profitability, customer satisfaction. A big one right now today is turnover. Others, we didn't find any evidence of that.
Yeah, that's surprising, because you might think that would be the case, that bosses would be extra nice to the employees they were more friendly with.
Part of it is likability spreads. We know that lots of things are contagious, right? Like COVID. But likability is contagious. And a boss that's likable, if one of their employees likes them, the others, it spreads.
So have we got it all wrong then, this idea that bosses need to be tough, they can be nice about it all?
You can be that way, but all the evidence we have suggests that the engagement of employees is going to be lower, the discretionary effort of employees is going to be lower, turnover of employees is going to be higher,
go ahead, be that way. It doesn't help.
So maybe, if we're lucky, unlikable bosses are going to become a thing of the past if everyone catches on to this.
I doubt that will happen.
Oh.
You know, it keeps me in work. Come on.
That's right. You don't want everyone to be too nice. Otherwise, what are you going to do if they're all too kind?
Yeah, well, I'm out of business.
Well, this pizza business certainly does seem to be thriving under a kind boss. And I think the kind thing to do would be to share my pizza with the architect of the kindness test, Robin Banerjee from the University of Sussex. So let's order something.
I was going to go for a double pepperoni and spicy honey.
I was looking at that.
I know.
Honey on a pizza.
Honey on a pizza.
Says trust us, it works.
If I can suggest, we also have our guest pizza.
Well, what about having one of each of those?
I've got to try it.
Robin, we ask people what sorts of workplaces value kindness. Where does hospitality come in there?
Hospitality actually came in close to the top. It doesn't necessarily mean that kindness is easy to do in those workplaces. It doesn't necessarily mean that kindness is always experienced in those workplaces. But it matters. This is all about making kindness normative, where that's just how it is in this place.
And in the kindness test, what other kinds of fields did people say they worked in where kindness really was valued?
The fields where kindness was most valued included social work, healthcare, and education.
Now that's interesting because lots of people I know, working in all of those fields often say they can't be as kind as they'd like to be, that there's either too much to do or that there are processes, well-intentioned processes often, or even technology that prevents them.
That's absolutely true. Quite often there are so many challenges to being kind. It can be really hard to be kind in those professions. However, what the people completing the kindness test were telling us was that kindness, when you see it, it makes a difference. When you experience it, it changes the environment in a positive way, and that's really important for us to recognise.
So we've had the workplaces where kindness seemed to be valued the most. Where scored lower on that?
I'll first of all say that kindness actually was valued quite highly everywhere, regardless of the field of work. But there were some differences. So the fields of work which were rated as being places where kindness was least valued were transport and storage industry, energy and water supply, finance and insurance, and manufacturing. But the fact that it's less valued, or was perceived to be less valued, suggests to me there might be a difference in terms of expectations of kindness, and that raises a really interesting question. What needs to change in order to create that culture of kindness in all those fields of work?
Okay, guys, we have the guest pizza here, Alessandro.
Oh, lovely, thank you.
This is double pepperoni spicy honey.
That looks lovely. Thanks ever so much. So we're going to get through them.
They look absolutely amazing. We're going to give it a good go.
Now, there is more I want to ask you about, Robin, but I'll leave you to have some pizza because I want to hear from Ross McMullen, who has been head teacher and a CEO in schools in the UK for more than 20 years until she retired just before the pandemic began. Is it sometimes difficult for head teachers to be as kind as they would like to be?
I think it is. I don't think there is anybody in the entire system that is acting from a bad place. However, what you have is there isn't the space to put kindness first. I often think that the thing with leaders is that they either are sponges and they're soaking up all the bad stuff, or they're like pipes and they're just passing things through. Now, I think that most leaders try to be the sponges. They try to soak up all that fear, all that toxicity, all that unkindness, and then they try to protect everybody around them. But of course you can't do that all the time, and ultimately you suffer yourself.
And in our research, the kindness test, one of the barriers that people said that prevented them from being kind sometimes when they wanted to be was a lack of time. I'm guessing time pressures must be pretty important for heads.
How you handle people requires thought, and it requires time in order to do things in the right way and to be as kind as you can. And quite often people are not in that situation.
Is it possible to be kind to yourself in that at all, or does that just get left behind?
Head teachers are very rarely kind to themselves. They're usually their biggest critics.
Robin, you were listening to Ross McMullen there.
Absolutely, and isn't that a striking pattern? Education settings are one of the fields of work where people felt that kindness is most valued, but it might be one of the places where it's really hard to be kind when you've got so many pressures on you.
And of course you run a huge psychology department in a university, and so some of this must feel, close to home for you. But what can leaders do if they feel that they are having to be a sponge and soak up all the stress.
Well, I think what we see time and again at the moment is that people feel that they have to be really brave, really courageous almost, in creating a kind culture despite the system. What we all want to see is an education system where no one feels that they have to be brave or courageous in order to create a kind culture. A kind culture should go hand in hand with a good, strong education system which fosters learning. Fundamentally, it requires us to avoid seeing kindness and academic success as being somehow in opposition to each other. It's not as though kindness is weak and academic success is what you need to really focus on, because that's the core business of schools. Actually, kindness is one of the key ingredients to get us there. I think there's a really strong connection between trust and kindness, and I think that tells us that in a workplace, in any organizational context, if we can nurture an environment where you've got trust, you're probably going to be nurturing an environment where you've got kindness.
And it's interesting that there is a new field of research into what's known as ethical leadership, and I'm wondering in a way if that might be an easier phrase for some to get on board with than kind leadership. So I knew I had to speak to one of the people who's pioneered this approach, Mike Brown, who's a professor of management at Penn State University in the US.
I remember very early on presenting research at conferences, and they wouldn't know where to put us on a conference platform because there was no one else doing this research. So the oddball, unrelated presentations would all go together.
So yours was one of the first studies to look at this in depth, really?
Yeah, so this was the first, and in 2005 we did a series of surveys with hundreds of employees from lots of different organizations to really get a bigger picture and refine our notion of what ethical leadership was and why it was important.
What does that mean? Is an ethical leader a kind leader?
At the heart of ethical leadership is that kindness, right? Because ethical leaders really care. They care about their employees. They care about creating a workplace where people are treated fairly and respect. They care about being trusted, and they care about the larger impacts their organizations have on society. And what we learned was you could really distill ethical leadership into two dimensions. So the first is what we called being a moral or ethical person. And that's about how ethical leaders manage themselves. The other dimension we found was that ethical leaders are also moral managers. They use the tools and the power and the authority of management to promote ethical conduct among their employees. So they act with integrity, they're honest, they're trustworthy, they're principled, open to feedback, they listen, they're humble. And for moral management, though, they're deliberately role model. Not just talk a good game, but live it out. And unethical is really the opposite. People who lie, who cut corners, who don't seem to act with principles, who don't listen to employees, don't hold people accountable.
Sorry, can't stop. Which brings us back to those bad boss stories. Now, the results from the kindness test highlighted the media as one of the areas where kindness was seen as least valued. Newsrooms have long had a bit of a reputation, and the other place are glossy magazines. Now, if you've seen The Devil Wears Prada, you will know exactly what I mean. But has the workplace changed and got kinder over time? I spoke to Lisa Smozarski, who is editor-in-chief of Stylist magazine. Now, she has set out deliberately to foster kindness. So we are talking about whether bosses can be kind.
I think absolutely bosses can be kind. I think there's been a real shift in working cultures, but I think, there's no smoke without fire, and certainly when I started, the idea of the editor as an ogre was certainly one that prevailed. I think one of the stories that really sticks with me is the story of a senior fashion team member locking their junior team member in the fashion cupboard until they finish their work, like physically turning the key. I mean, it's just abhorrent.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
What happened afterwards?
Nothing. Now, I certainly didn't actually have an editor like that, but the idea that might happen was quite paralyzing, actually. I started in 1998 in magazines. I think Devil Wears Prada comes out a bit after that, but it's at this peak of the idea of the terrifying editor, which comes on the back of 80s, 90s toxic work culture, I think.
You now lead a very successful magazine. Did you deliberately decide you were going to be a kind boss?
I think I did decide that, actually. I mean, I was an editor at a very young age, at 25.
25?
I had to learn on the job very quickly. I think certainly as I came into Stylist was a magazine about doing things differently. We create content that mirrors the changes in our world, and in turn that affects how we work as managers, I think.
Are other magazines still very cutthroat, or is this a wider cultural change?
I think it's a wider cultural change. Now, there are some establishments might be hanging on to some of that old school hierarchy, but I think their days are numbered. And I think really there are lots of different reasons for this. Partly, there's just a huge cultural shift in our conversations, in how our young team members expect to be managed. They have agency, they understand their rights.
So would they just not put up with it if you were mean to them?
I doubt it. I think you'd find yourself on the back of a complaint very quickly. And I think that's one of the interesting power dynamics that have changed. And I think social media has been particularly useful in this instance. Now, we know social media can be terribly unkind.
Well, funnily enough, in the kindness test, social media did come up as one of the barriers to acting more kindly.
But equally, it can be very empowering, it can give you a voice, and it can give you access to information. So I think when you realise that you have power in return, then actually that dynamic starts to shift. It's been sped up, I think, by the pandemic, but I think even prior to that, we'd seen a movement, really, that saw managers taking on more empathetic roles. So absolutely, I think kindness can prevail in the workplace.
Sounds lovely. I think everyone's going to come and want to work for you now.
I wish I had the job sticking. Fair enough.
But there is a bottom line here, and plenty of workplaces which don't seem to have become kinder, where staff have little autonomy, low pay, 0 hours contracts, you name it. I'm not sure that I will have convinced every manager yet that kindness can lead to success. We heard about one big study earlier, but do we really have enough evidence on this? Mike Brown again.
We have now, in almost 20 years of research, really discovered that ethical leadership is not just about creating ethical workplaces. I don't think we realize, though, just all of the other benefits. So employees are more satisfied with their jobs, more committed, more willing to go above and beyond. I think for me, the big study, and I was involved in this, found that ethical leaders are actually rated by their superiors as having higher promotion potential to senior management positions.
And is it the case that an ethical leader can still do difficult things? Because you could imagine a situation, I don't know, if one member of staff isn't pulling their weight, then they might be being kind to them by letting them off that, but that might be unkind to everyone else who has to pick up their work instead. So a conversation might need to be had with that person to explore what's going on there. Can kind bosses still do that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And if not having that conversation means that it's putting more stress on other workers to pick up the slack, well, that's not the right thing to do.
It would be unethical.
Yeah, absolutely, because you would be enabling a free rider problem, right? You would have employees doing not only their job, but then someone else's job, and that's not kindness. I think one of the signature elements of ethical leadership is that they do hold people accountable.
Now, it sounds all very lovely having this ethical workplace, and sounds like a lovely place to work, but is there a concern that some might have that, I don't know, if they're too kind a leader, they might be perceived as soft or weak, and that they won't be able to make the difficult decisions?
So kindness doesn't mean weakness. Meek doesn't mean weak, right? An ethical leader is kind, but they're not a pushover. We'll say there is no easy time or good time to really focus on ethical leadership, but it's difficult. People are stressed, people are tired, economic insecurity, COVID, all of these things have stressed us out even more than we are. I don't know about you, but when I'm tired, when I'm stressed, when I'm worried, I'm not the most kind person, and I know that of a lot of people. It makes it harder.
Lovely to talk to you.
You guys are awesome.
Thanks.
I wish I could have you edit my life. Life would be so much simpler. Right?
That's right, you just get to do it again and it's all right.
Yeah, there you go. You guys are rock stars. Thank you, Claudia.
Cheers. Well, time for another slice of pizza with Robin Banerjee. Mike Brown's very kind.
I've never been called a rock star before, but I'm going to take it.
It's good. So what have we learned, Robin? I mean, the question I set out to answer was, can you be a kind boss? I think it seems clear that not all bosses are always kind, but that sometimes they'd like to be, and other things are stopping them. And maybe the answer is the time we need to be the kindest is the time that it can be most stressful and be the hardest.
I think that's absolutely true, but perhaps this is one of the greatest opportunities for people to come together. That depends on kindness. You could almost say, this is going to sound a bit corny, you could almost say when the going gets tough, it's the kind that get going.
Nothing is too corny for us, Robin, I can assure you. And it was reassuring that the bosses we heard from, like Lisa, the magazine editor, and Tom, who founded this pizza place, that they do believe it's possible to be kind.
And that hope is such an important one for us to hold on to, because I think the very worst thing we could do is to just say, well, you know what, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But here in the real world, we just don't have time for it.
It is tempting to say that, though, isn't it? Because Joe and Mike were both convincing, but then Mike listed all the virtues of an ethical leader. They need to be principled and humble and open to feedback and be role models for everyone else. And I don't know, in a way it struck me, it sounds quite a lot to ask. You know, I'm not a manager, but I've watched a lot of them in my time, and it looks hard enough already.
It's a lot to ask, yes, that's true. But kindness isn't something that has to be forced. It's not about telling people, hey, all of you guys, you now need to start being kind. It's about just living it and just about connecting with the people around you. One of the things the kindness test has shown us is that when people are kind, they report feeling more connected. These can be very small things, but they make a massive difference.
So 60,000 people filled in the kindness test. You have more than 9 million data points to work with. And in this series, we've asked whether you can be a kind boss, of course, whether we're kinder to people like us, and whether there's any such thing as pure kindness. But what happens next with all that data you've got?
Well, to us, this is just the beginning. It's like we've set an agenda for the research. What we need to do now is to pursue some really complex models around the role that kindness plays in our lives and to actually get that out into the scientific literature. I think it's going to have a really big impact. So we're really looking forward to adding to the science in this area. We know that it matters to people. We know that it's connected with well-being. We know that people experience it in many, many different ways. All of those things matter. The kindness test has told us that. The next step is going to be then, how do we nurture it? How do we foster it?
Well, I think you've got your work cut out there. Do you want another slice of pizza before you get started?
I think I need it.
Thank you. Robin Banerjee from Sussex University in the UK there. And thank you to the producer of Health Check, Erica Wright. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Claudia Hammond. And I'll be back with more from Health Check from the BBC at the same time next week. Bye for now.